I agree. We might be both right, we might be both wrong. In fact, there are 4 different combinations possible. I want to find out more about what some people, including me, sense to be the secret power at the heart of interactive documentary. It's a multi-perspectival view on something without valuing one perspective higher than another, as there is always a hierarchy when ordering things, what comes first, what comes last, in a linear way. Neutral perspective and wanting change is contradictory to each other, as it often happens that what one wants shapes what one witnesses. I think this affordance to not want is at the core of the magic of interactive documentary. Interactive documentary is a tool like a pencil, a tool that does not want things, but a thing that makes certain exercises for the mind possible that would not or not that easily be possible without that tool. This is just grandpa talking. It is not the tool that changes, it is the doing, the exercise. Hi, my name is Florian Thalhofer and I'm the inventor of Korsakow, a software that can be used for making interactive documentaries. I have been using this software myself for making interactive documentaries for more than 20 years. Since last year, I'm a member of a research group that looks at interactive documentary based at HSLU in Switzerland, and I started to do a practice-based PhD at UWE in the UK. I look at interactive documentary not only from the position of a maker, but also as someone who has developed a software for making interactive documentaries and someone who has given workshops for 20 years, where I have advised and observed many people use, struggle and succeed with making this very particular kind of documentary. As pointed out, for example, by Franziska Weidle, Korsakow, the software that I came up with, is quite unique when it comes to software for making interactive documentaries. The approach of most softwares in this field is to allow authors to build multiple paths through their material. You can do that in Korsakow too, but what Korsakow allows one to do is to create generative documentaries. This means that authors do not build paths, but create rules. And based on these rules, paths are then calculated at the moment the project is viewed. This usually not only leads to different paths every time the project is watched, but also to connections authors did not preconceive. These are not random paths. They are the result of rules and circumstances, but they might be new and unexpected even for authors themselves. The non-Korsakow way of laying out concrete paths, I would say, puts authors into the same mindset as authors of a linear experience. For example, a linear film, where one also preconceives paths. In the case of a linear film, only one single path. In Korsakow, you don't pre-think. This, I argue, liberates authors from pre-thinking paths through their material. And that has a couple of interesting consequences. For example, it puts authors into the position of being audience as well, as they have to watch the piece to experience the various connections that come up as a consequence of their assumptions. I do autoethnographic research. I just recently started to do a practice-based PhD, and I'm currently in the process of learning what autoethnographic research is. And I already learned that it is important to state that I'm doing autoethnography right in the beginning, because otherwise the impression might come up that this is just grandpa talking, as some of my new colleagues in the field pointed out to me. So, to be clear, the only reason why I talk about myself is because I want to find out more about what some people, including me, sense to be the secret power at the heart of interactive documentary. Anna Wiel pre-recorded her talk, the one we saw in the beginning of this panel, and that gives me the opportunity to pick up a thread from her talk, a tiny thread that resonates in the background and that I often sense resonating in the background when interactive documentary is discussed. It is the notion that interactive documentary wants or affords change. Anna Wiel seems to think so, which can be noticed a couple of times in her talk, for example, here.
As such, co-creative documentary projects don't simply document or passively observe the world, but insist on change.
I would like to comment on that, and I hope that what I want to say is helpful. I know Anna Wiel for years and I feel like we know each other quite well. I would say we think similarly. We met through Korsakow, the system that Anna often talks about, not in her talk today. I assume that Korsakow had an effect on the wiring of both of our brains. I have heard quite a few of her talks over the years, very often about Korsakow, a topic that is obviously very near to me. I told Anna, so I can tell you, I usually don't understand much in her talks. Anna speaks a very precise and, at least to my ears, very complicated language. Just recently, I entered academic languaging, as biologists and cyberneticians Maturana and Valera put it. And the training I received, and also the fact that I could watch Anna's talk word by word, with many stops, going back, thinking, looking out words and concepts, put me into the position that I can proudly say that I understood her talk this time. And I have to say, I agree. I agree with Anna Wiel's observations and conclusions on so many levels that it would be boring to elaborate more on that, because that would just make me repeat her talk in different words maybe, but still. Instead, I want to focus on the one thing we disagree, not because I think I am right. I'm actually not sure if I'm right. We might be both right. We might be both wrong. In fact, there are 4 different combinations possible. So I decided to focus on the one thing we disagree because I would like to point to something that I sense that could be an important door to a better understanding of what that is, that beast that we are examining, and that is, of course, interactive documentary. So why do I call it a beast? Because a beast as a living entity can want something. Much loved Sandra Gaudenzi called interactive documentary living documentary in the title of her groundbreaking PhD. So let's assume for now that interactive documentary is not a dead thing but a living being that can want something. It is suggested that interactive documentary wants change, and by pointing that out, it suggests that this is something that distinguishes interactive documentary from other forms, let's say non-interactive documentary. And this is where I slightly disagree. The first and more obvious objection would be that also non-interactive documentary affords change maybe as much as interactive documentary, and I would argue even much more. The wanting change, the call for action in linear documentary seems to me to be intrinsic to the linearity of the medium of, for example, film itself. And this brings me to where I see a significant distinction, and this is my second objection. In my mind, interactive documentary affords to not want change. In other words, while many people suggest that interactive documentary is particularly good in wanting change, I think it is particularly good in allowing to not ask for change. When I talk about interactive documentary, I look at it from the angle of Korsakow, or more generally from the angle of generative documentary. I'm not sure if my observations can be generalized for the whole of interactive documentary in the wide sense of Judith Aston and Sandra Gaudenzi, who said that interactive documentary can be everything that uses digital interactive technology and intends to document the real. But I certainly hope my observations might be helpful considering that wider field. I think that the greatest power of generative documentary, and that might be also true for all kinds of interactive documentary, is to afford users, and here I mean the combination of authors and viewers, to not formulate a story, to not formulate a message, a call for action, a call for change. This, I think, is a prerequisite for what I would like to call neutral perspective, which is a multi-perspectival view on something without valuing one perspective higher than another. In that sense, I would argue that to achieve neutral perspective, there can no wanting be involved, because wanting always values perspectives. Things that are wanted are conceived better than things that are not wanted. And that way, neutral perspective obviously might be difficult to achieve. To achieve neutral perspective seems to me to be hard, if not impossible, in non-interactive and linear narrations, as there is always a hierarchy when ordering things. What comes first, what comes last, in a linear way. I think neutral perspective is excellent to raise awareness, but raised awareness may or may not lead to change. And sometimes the best thing to do might be to not change anything. Changing the mind might happen or not, but if it happens, it usually happens at a later point in time, after the multitudes of perspectives have been digested, after multiple brains have collaboratively exchanged their ideas. I would argue that neutral perspective and wanting change is contradictory to each other, as it often happens that what one wants shapes what one witnesses. Confirmation bias is the concept that describes that phenomenon. I think this affordance to not want is at the core of the magic of interactive documentary. What distinguishes it from, let's say, documentary film, that, as I would argue, affords action and wanting change. The beast that can want, in my opinion, is not interactive documentary, it is the mind. The beast that constantly wants something. Interactive documentary is a tool like a pencil, a tool that does not want things, but a thing that makes certain exercises for the mind possible that would not or not that easily be possible without that tool. Like drawing, like writing, like sharing ideas, and by doing all that, influencing the way the mind works. It is not the tool that changes, it is the doing, the exercise. I would say that a tool may be any tool, but certainly the tool interactive documentary allows for practices that change the mind. Again, it is not the tool that changes the mind, but the practice of using it that brings the consequences for the culture, for the society. And that might take a while, maybe generations, to figure out the relevant practices. To conclude, I argue for the separation of describing the problem and wanting when making interactive documentary. I begin with the assumption that every documentary starts with a problem or topic. Describing the problem should be as unbiased as possible, and to do so, we want to be as multi-perspectival and polyphonic as possible. To understand the problem as good as we can, and for that, we want to look at it from as many perspectives as achievable. Discuss it with as many interested minds as possible. For that, it is important to also focus on the no problem and non-problem elements of any given problem that usually exist as well. So let me explain what I mean with that. Non-problem elements are aspects of a given topic or problem that are not considered to be a problem by either side. These are, you could say, positive consequences of a problem that often get lost when the problem is discussed. Let me think of an example. Okay, I tried this. I hope it is not too controversial. Climate change makes nice summers, for example, in Germany, which you might have noticed by looking at my sunglasses. But, you might think, and this but that comes up immediately might be a good indicator to recognize a non-problem. On the other hand, a no-problem element is something that is considered to be no problem by a particular group, while it is considered to be a problem by another group. An example would be how Trump supporters generally looked at climate change. For them, it seemed to be not a problem at all. For the other group, the group of the non-Trump supporters, it generally was a problem. And there are also no problems the other way around, where Trump supporters saw a problem and non-Trump supporters, for example, usually did not. The topic of immigration springs to my mind. So no problem elements are aspects that are no problem for one side, but a problem for the other side. Wouldn't it be amazing to think through problems with the help of brains that seem to be so far apart, like, for example, and excuse me of using the word us here, us and Trump supporters? I think this is only possible if we separate describing and wanting, if we separate thinking in a collaborative thinking process from wanting. This, I think, is hard, if not at all impossible, to achieve in a linear or unisequential format, like, for example, in a linear film. But I think this is not only possible with interactive documentary. I believe it is at the heart of the magic of interactive documentary, at least at the heart of the magic of Korsakow. So no further steps should be designed or even wished for in advance when making such an interactive documentary, as already laid out paths usually make it difficult to find better ways. I argue that if recognized problems and relevant solutions exist side by side, the solutions will be naturally implemented. How? That needs to be figured out in other separate processes. But this is not what I consider to be interactive documentary.